Hello, I'm Fredrik and I'm the filmmaker in Malmö, Sweden.
And I'm Leilani Farha. I'm the advocate in rural Canada.
Yeah, I can actually see you here on the video. I can see a lake.
That's correct. Big Gull Lake.
I mean, it looks amazing. So you're actually on vacation.
Vacation, indeed. 1 week away time. So I'm not in Ottawa. It's amazing.
You really deserve it. You worked a lot, and you really have. And I know your assignment as a UN Special Rapporteur ended end of April.
It did.
And now you're a global director of the Shift.
Yep.
But since the lockdown, mid-March, you've been working 24/7, more than ever. But you have not been traveling, but you've been on these calls all the time. Tell me, what has it all been about? I guess the virus has been up there all the time, isn't it?
Absolutely. The virus took hold. Well, you'll remember, Fredrik, that in early March, you and I were in London and in Prague. And the virus was known, but it hadn't been declared a pandemic. I think it got declared while we were in Prague. And I then returned back to Canada, went on what ended up being a 2-day vacation with my family to Florida, got to Florida, realized this was a pandemic and that we needed to get home. And it has been nonstop ever since. And I guess for me, the story begins with the WHO, the World Health Organization, because they were the first, of course, as the World Health Organization, to come up with a prescription for this virus. And the prescription they came up with was obviously not drugs because it's a new virus. So the prescription was stay home. That was the main message right at the beginning, stay home, and then wash your hands and physical distance. Yeah.
And homes, that's what you've been talking about for 6 years and more.
Exactly. So
because before you became the UN Special Rapporteur, you were also being the head of the major poverty organization in Canada.
That's right.
So you've been working with the homeless.
That's right. I've been doing housing and homelessness for years and years, for more than 20 years. When the WHO said that we should all be staying home, the light bulb went on for me quite quickly. And I have to say, I think I was one of the first out the gate to really realize the implication of this for people living in homelessness and for people living in informal settlements. Obviously, you can't stay home if you don't have a home. So that's the entire homeless population around the world. And I know that population to be, upward of, there's no real count, but upward of 800 million people. So,
I saw a number today. There's 1 billion people living in informal settlements around the world. Yeah. 1 billion.
That's right. The figure I tend to use is 1.8 billion living in informal settlements and homelessness. And so if you're living in an informal settlement, whether it's in Kenya or whether it's in India or South Africa or wherever, or Los Angeles, you don't have access to water and sanitation. You can't physically distance if you're living in an emergency shelter, and you don't have a home. Obviously, if you're living on the streets in an encampment or something like that, an informal settlement, it's not always enough to protect you from this virus. So I knew right away that we were in troubled waters. I knew it would explode open the housing crisis that I've been talking about for 6 years and experiencing in every city and country that I've visited. And so I landed back home in my home, having to fight and argue with governments really to do more and do better to protect that particular population.
Because this, Leilani, I don't understand. I don't think everybody understands that you actually talk to governments. They talk to you. You talk to governments and you tell them you should go this way. And you talk to city governments. I know you talk to the city of Barcelona, you talk to Paris, you talk to London, you talk to Montreal, to Vancouver, to Toronto, and many more cities, also in Nairobi, Kenya, and so on. So you are really a global advocate.
Absolutely.
And
with
so
governments,
what do you tell? What do you tell? What do you tell them?
Yeah. So, well, what I did as soon as I could was I wrote a series of guidance notes and shot a series of homemade videos about what I thought governments should be doing. I actually thought, Fredrik, to be honest, when the pandemic hit and we had this, and government, it wasn't just the World Health Organization, every government around the world except maybe Sweden had enforced this, stay home policy. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, we're going to end global homelessness. I really believed that. I thought
that's a good feeling.
Yeah,
so you felt good
here's
for
the moment.
a few minutes. You felt good.
That's right. And to be honest, I'm going to be fair here. I have spoken with particularly city level governments, and there is an understanding that homelessness has, by many city level governments, that homelessness has to end, and that they really need to be working toward its elimination. Like cities like the city of London.
Give us some examples. What has happened? What has happened?
Yeah, well, if you look at the city of London, I mean, they've had a huge homelessness problem. Despite some pretty good legislation in place, they've had a homelessness problem. Obviously, London is one of the most expensive cities in the world in which to live, and a lot of homelessness. And the city moved quite quickly to house homeless people, and they went to extreme measures. I mean, they negotiated with a major hotel chain to ensure people living on the streets could actually access safe hotel rooms and therefore physical distance, and have access to sanitation. And they were even housing people in parts of Heathrow, the airport, because they just knew they had to get people off the streets, both to protect that population, but to protect the broader population as well, right? One person with COVID could affect the entire country's population. And so they moved really quickly. Even in...
That story is not really told. I mean, this is like... I don't think everybody knows about this.
No.
This is like quite amazing that suddenly we've seen people sleeping rough for years. And I mean... the last year has been horrible, yes. But suddenly they could solve it like this.
Well, Fredrik, think back to us in San Francisco when Push opened at the Castro and how we saw wall-to-wall homeless people. Well, the city of San Francisco, city of Los Angeles, Oakland, all moved quite quickly to try to start housing people in hotel rooms, for example, and other accommodations. I'm not saying it's enough. Particularly in the California context where homelessness is huge. But we have been seeing new energies for this. Look at Lisbon. Recently that the city of Lisbon has decided to go after empty accommodation to ensure that that's available to people who need homes rather than just sitting there idly. Barcelona.
Well, Barcelona is now starting to actually to take apartments if they are empty. The city will grab them and they will pay half of the market price to the owner if they stand empty. So either you rent it to somebody or we will take it for half the market price.
Yeah, pretty radical. Pretty radical. I mean,
it is.
Of course, we've been agitating for these sorts of measures before the pandemic. Sometimes, obviously, it takes a pandemic to really motivate governments. One of the worries, I should say also, in informal settlements, I've heard that in Kenya, for example, in Nairobi, some of the largest informal settlements in the world, they now have access to water and sanitation that they didn't have before. I visited Nigeria in the fall. I was alarmed by some of the conditions in informal settlements, really no water and sanitation in particular. And I've heard that food, water, and sanitation have moved in to some degree into some of those informal settlements. So, I mean, these are all very good news stories. I'm not convinced that the path forward is that pretty, to be honest. So that's what I'm now obviously worried about. And there's a whole other group of tenants or residents that I'm worried about. And I know you are too. We've had conversations about this, but all the folks who are paying their rent, but who are hitting economic hard times and are having trouble paying the rent.
and they can't pay the rents. And this is what also here in wealthy Sweden, there's a lot of reports of tenants who can't pay their rents any longer because they lost their job. There's a lot of people who have short-term jobs, like restaurants and shops and so on, and they normally survive quite well. I know I have a lot of friends who are musicians. They are totally, all of them, out of work. So there's a lot of people who have problems paying the rent. And there are some good landlords stepping out and saying, okay, I understand my tenants are suffering, so of course I will charge only 50% or less. But a lot of people around the world, a lot of companies around the world, for them it's business as usual. And we hear from the United States there is a huge wave of evictions now in the midst of the
about
pandemic.
To happen. Yeah. Well, and I think in some places there have been moratoriums on evictions, which, under international human rights law, we always say an eviction that leads to homelessness is not compliant with international human rights law. And many evictions for arrears result in homelessness. I would never advocate just a moratorium on those sorts of evictions. They have to. It was wrong-headed for governments, in my opinion, to just say moratorium. I think they could have said short-term moratorium, long-term we're gonna look at this situation and figure out how do we keep people housed when they are not paying their rent. That would have been a very sophisticated thing for governments to do. Of course, in the midst of a pandemic, people are scrambling, governments are scrambling. I have some sympathy for them, to be honest. This is unprecedented, as everyone said. So they take these emergency measures, and then what's worrying is this failure to ensure and protect people once things, in quotes, start getting back to normal. And so in the States, there have been moratoriums on evictions, but now those moratoriums are expiring. And landlords were issuing eviction notices not to take place during the moratorium, but as soon as the moratorium ends, those eviction notices become live. So that's the real scare. And that's not unique to the U.S., I don't think,
But we're talking about millions of people.
That's what they're saying.
Who are under a total stress, one stress above the other stress. But when you talk to the government, for example, of your own country, Canada, so what do you tell them and what do they answer? Do they get like, oh, come on, Leilani, don't be so aggressive, or what is the language?
Yeah, so it depends on on the level of government. I've noticed that city level governments are deeply concerned and really interested in having at least creative conversations. Certainly in Canada, I've started a working group across the country of cities. So there's 12 cities engaged, from Vancouver, Victoria, Toronto, small town, London, Ontario, Edmonton, etc. So, and
they're all going to watch
Push. They are next week. Very exciting. Super, super cool. But this is what I mean, Fredrik. Cities have an appetite right now for thinking differently, for learning, for trying to fashion new remedies. So I felt at city level, the conversations, they're not easy conversations, because what I have to say is not easy. So one of the things that's happened in many places is actually, instead of homelessness ending, it's increased. The exact opposite of what I thought should happen in the pandemic. And so why has it increased? Well, governments have imposed, let's say, distancing requirements. So if you're operating a shelter for homeless people, you suddenly have to spread the beds further apart, which means fewer beds, which means some people are out. And those people who are out have nowhere to go. So they're setting up encampments. Those encampments are then being disbanded often by police and city level officials, and then those people also then have nowhere to go. So we're seeing kind of escalation of homelessness in some places. It's very depressing. That being said, I do think governments at city level are really open to finding some solutions. At higher levels,
I saw that they are.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I saw that in San Francisco, they're actually putting up some tent camp now. They've had all these informal camps, but now they're putting up an official tent camp with showers and stuff. It sounds like Africa almost.
Yeah, and I have. You see, this is what I mean. My messages are difficult for governments to hear. I mean, I think a city feels like we're doing the right thing. We're sanctioning an encampment. We're going to make sure it has everything it needs. I've seen those places before. They call them navigation centers. I went to one in San Diego. They part of the problem with something like that is that it's not organic. It's not actually of the people. So it becomes this sort of state-imposed place. Often there are rules and regulations that people living in homelessness really can't abide by. For example, they might be dry locations. In other words, you can't drink alcohol. Well, for someone in rough times and hard times, alcohol can be a soothing thing, or you can have an addiction, which is a disability of some sort, and you may require alcohol, and so it's no good to you. Or they'll say no pets, for example. Some places have that. Well, for homeless people, pets are super important, right? Because it's comfort and your best friend. So I'm not so convinced that these sanctioned encampments are the right solution. But that's what I mean. My messages are tough.
Back to the government. So what did the government tell you?
I mean, in Canada, it's a complicated situation. Well, the federal government thinks that it's complicated because they don't have jurisdiction for housing. They constitutionally, they have the ability to spend on housing, but they don't have the ability to legislate on housing, is what they say. It's not totally true, and I think there's some hiding behind that. It's harder to get federal government to think creatively, to take leadership. I mean, what I was really asking, and I'm asking all national governments, regardless of the constitutional framework in a country, national governments should have been saying and should still be saying that homes are as important as ventilators, for example. Every government said, oh my God, we need ventilators and we need that, what do they call it, PPE, personal protective equipment or whatever. Every government was demanding that and saying, contacting China, contacting this, trying to get those two things in place to protect against the virus. And I'm saying your policy, your health policy is stay at home. Surely you should be going to the same measures and exercising the same leadership to ensure everyone has access to an adequate home. And for some reason, my message, I don't know, it's not, I think it's really as simple as there's a lack of understanding of housing as a human right. There's a lack of understanding of the contradiction in having a stay-at-home policy and then not actually ensuring everyone has a home. Oh, my gosh. So I have a little friend coming to visit. I don't know if you can see Fredrik. We're zooming this for those of you who are listening. So there's a chipmunk right by my side. So I was startled. Sorry. It's a chipmunk.
What is it?
Let's see. Oh, it ran away. It's afraid of computers, as it should be.
Okay.
Sorry, I was startled.
Okay. That's like sitting out in the nature. Right. That's beautiful. I wish I could join you, but I guess I won't get there. So no, but I mean, it's housing. We could see homes as societal infrastructure, like as we see roads and bridges and railroads and airports.
Social infrastructure, exactly.
Our society needs infrastructure, and homes are also infrastructure. And now the government are emitting this enormous amounts of money to save the economy, to save the people. But strangely enough, homes are not really on the list. So you would say that governments are actually missing an opportunity here?
I think they are, but then you and I can go deeper in light of the work we've done and what continues to animate our thoughts and interest, which is, you see, if you give money to people and say, okay, then use that money for housing, you're not disrupting the market system of housing in any way. You're actually allowing this major economic structure and aspect of finance to remain intact. If you start saying, oh, we're going to buy this hotel that's a distressed asset and we're going to turn it in, it's going to become a public good and we're going to turn it into deeply affordable housing, that starts disrupting something. And I have to wonder whether my activism is perceived as trying to disrupt structures that governments at national level in particular want to remain in place. So that's what I mean when I say I think governments are still not willing to recognize housing as a human right. I think they're so wedded to it as a commodity and the structures in our society. So to think about it as social infrastructure is way too dismantling, perhaps, which is sobering.
And it's because when London are putting people into hotels now during the virus crisis, it's good for the homeless, but it's also helping the hotel industry for a while. Absolutely. So they're more into saving the hotel industry than the homeless, because that's not it's not the long-term solution, because the hotel industry will like to have their rooms back. Right. So it's all about having affordable homes for everybody, and of course, homeless people also need support so they can pay the rent.
Absolutely, and that will be. I think you tapped right into, sort of where my gaze is now, because it's like, okay, so things are opening up, this stage 3 or whatever they call it in different countries, and in at least in the global north, things are opening up. What's going to happen? Are they going to return people living in hotels onto the streets? One thing that's, I think, well, under international law, that's considered retrogressive and is also not compliant. So once you've improved someone's condition, you can't then turn around and make it worse again. Although, presumably they can plead bankruptcy or they can plead austerity, which they've done before, right? Governments have done that before. So, but now's the time to be asking those questions. What's the long-term plan here? And I mean,
because it's this virus crisis is horrible and it's stressful for everyone, but in many countries it was actually the rich people who were out traveling who brought it in from their vacations in Italy, in Austria, and other places, and especially in Latin America and Africa and other places. It actually was the rich people traveling in, and I remember when we talked just when this started, that you said this will soon be a problem for other people, and now there is a very clear pattern. Also here in Sweden, that people who are living too many in one small apartment, people who can't work at home, people who are driving buses, sitting in the supermarkets, even hospital workers and so on, are the ones who have been most severely hit by the virus, and now you can see the explosion in Brazil and the US. It's like it's a lot of low income people. You could also call them working class, or you could call them. I mean, you are not a Marxist, and I don't read that thick books anyway. So, there is some kind of societal structure in who are suffering most. And still, it's not really what we talk about. Here in Europe, it's been a big thing about this support package, big negotiations between the government to save the economy, especially for the countries worst hit, Italy and Spain. But nobody, Greta Thunberg is criticizing them for putting the climate aside. And we could also criticize them for putting the housing issue aside, because it's not on the table.
Not in the real way, not in a significant way.
And with all this money they are putting out, they could actually do something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because somebody else is doing something. So this is something we also raised. When economy go down, there is it's bargain time. It's shopping time for people who are sitting on big amounts of money. And who are these guys, Leilani?
Yeah, the big financial actors, the private equity firms who still have most of their money intact. their liquidity remains, their ability to create investment funds remains. Last week, I saw 2 announcements that Blackstone had managed to, I guess, finalize 2 big investment funds, one of which is a real estate fund. And so they're waiting. And I know you do too. I'm constantly reading, like, what are these guys up to? What are they saying? What are they anticipating? And you see, part of the problem is that they will pounce, but it's not necessarily tomorrow. If you look at 2008 in the global financial crisis or the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009, what happened was it took a bit of time before it became clear that there were going to be all these distressed assets, right? Assets don't become distressed overnight. That's something that happens over time. And so these guys are waiting. They know that this will happen. They're talking about it. I'm reading article after article in the business section of various newspapers and magazines and online things. And so they will pounce when they feel the time is right. The question is, how do we get governments to do what's necessary to make that a hostile environment so that they don't invade like they did in 2008 and 2009?
There were some governments saying early on that we will not give support packages to companies who have shell companies in tax havens. But it's been really silent about that. And I guess the reason is that it's the tax havens, I mean, all companies have shell companies in tax havens. Yeah. And of course, they also have official companies in real legislation. So I guess they find a way to get the support packages anyway. And then you also mentioned early on that Blackstone, the biggest private equity firm, they were part of a group lobbying the U.S. Congress on the crisis packages, the content of the crisis packages, which meant that then the fracking industry that naturally should go down because it would be a good thing for the planet if it went down, got a lot of money. So you can see how these guys act. They act to protect themselves, and of course, helping poor people to get a home is totally not in their interest.
Yeah, you know what dawns on me just now, Fredrik, is it seems to me that the arguments that are becoming persuasive for government action are arguments where, if government does this, it's going to be good for the economy. And that's where, if we start arguing, well, you need more affordable housing, that's good for the economy. Governments don't see that as the truth, even though there is truth there. But that's what worries me, right? So we have to, I think, talk more about the myth that private equity somehow creates financial energy, that it somehow contributes to economies. Because I think in one of our previous podcasts, we did discuss that, not at length, but, people like Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate economist, and Saskia Sassen, the sociologist, talk about the fact that this is not productive money. It doesn't produce things for economies, this private equity money that gets sunk into real estate. And so I think part of our work now is to get that message out, because I think the resistance against doing anything around housing is, well, how is that good for the economy? And right now, everything has to be about the economy because the world is suffering huge, huge losses.
Yeah, people, I mean, the economy, I guess the economy should be there for the people in the countries or the people of the world. That's why we need an economy that works, so people don't starve, I guess. But the result of the 2008 crisis is that the income equality has grown in an extreme way. So none of us have really made, we're still at the same level as 10 years ago. But then these kind of the 1%ers, whatever, they are so much richer now. And them being richer is not only, a problem of, envy or something like that. It's actually a democratic problem that they are richer, because they are now much stronger in buying lobby, pushing governments, making moves, making it harder for governments and local governments to move, because they are also pushing up the prices of building and the homes and the grounds in the cities. So it's harder for local governments to move now than before. So it is a democratic problem that the income inequality is so much worse now than before. It's been bad before, but now it's at a new level, and this new level also means that the interesting thing is that now almost like even the upper middle class is now also a part of like the same kind of segment, because you can see now in many cities when I talk about people marching in the streets in Chile, in Beirut, or in the US. It's not only the poor people or the students, whatever. It's actually also architects out there. It's like engineers out there. It's doctors out there, because they're also amongst people who have lost out. So it's like the whole normal civil society have lost out, and these guys, they're still on the top, and they're still on the top of the storytelling of how we explain, how we understand the economy. And of course, that their explanation models are the ones they use to push for these support packages that are now saving their business, but not the people, which is, I think, totally problematic. That was a little speech for me, wasn't it?
I like that speech. It was good. It was good. It made me think for some reason. I did read yesterday that in this, U.S. presidential time, as they're, they're all campaigning. I did hear or read that Biden has said that he's going to impose some corporate tax on institutional investors in real estate, and then use that tax to fund some social program. But it wasn't a housing program, so of course I took issue with that. But still, it is interesting to me that it's now at least it's acceptable for him to articulate that. You got to think this is a very mainstream, probably right of center politician going after real estate transactions.
I actually saw a scary thing or an interesting thing on Bloomberg News the other day, that is one of the big Blackstone guys. He had what do you call it, funding party for Biden. So he actually is making rich people put money towards Biden, and then he said he wants to be the new Minister of Commerce, whatever it's called. So you could see, the positive note could be that also Blackstone, the other guys, can see that Trump might lose. So they need to put money on the other side. So they don't get, they have to invest into the new government, and to make sure that they will get a say in the new politics coming up.
So let's keep our eye on whether Biden, if he does win, whether he sticks to his corporate tax on institutional investors in real estate, if now Blackstone is going after them for support.
Yeah, these guys, they put money in all campaigns if they can. So if they probably have more money into Trump's campaign anyway. But it's like they are gambling guys, So for them it's politics is also about placing your marks, And you lose and you win. It's not a big thing.
But, some of the big voices in the States are coming out. Yesterday AOC had a video that came across my feed where she's, saying, housing is a human right. Ilhan Omar, also a congresswoman, housing is a human right. So maybe that will influence the Bidens, right? Up to the same party.
That's good. And push the film.
Yes.
Now we have release dates, so it will be released in the US early September. It should have been out already end of April. So we had a theatrical release booked. It was booked from many cities, so it's halted, and hopefully we can get it out now. We still don't really know in what conditions, because we don't know if the theaters will be open. So it's a special.
It's a perfect time.
But for sure, if you are in the US, write to us, because we need your help to get this film out, because it's a very good tool to talk about things, also what happens in your own city. And if you like this podcast, you should rate it high on iTunes. I hear that's something really, 5 stars is important. So tell your friends to rate it high, and spread the news about this podcast. We are still beginners and learners, but so also give us feedback how we can do it better, and maybe also subject matters, things you think we should look into. And if you haven't seen the film, it's out in most countries in the world, and you can find it through pushtofilm.com. Leilani, in the early part of this podcast, talked about her recommendations to governments. So you should then go to her website, maketheshift.org, where you can actually read all about this. The website is quite new. There are some fixes to be done. I could see you still have this kind of.
Yes, we're working on
it.
But
anyway, you're working on it. But there is, I mean, your recommendations to governments and cities are up there. So use them if you're working in a city in some kind of level. Bring it to your mayor's attention, and have them to join this shift, because it's a global movement about the right to housing. Leilani, I think you should. It's time for you to go for a swim. Actually, I would like to see you just walk out and jump into the water. That would be amazing. But you should go for a swim, and I will also go for a swim, because it's actually also a nice day here in.
I have to go before
Malmö.
the rains come down. Yes, indeed.
And this podcast is now out on most platforms. Tell us if you're missing it somewhere. And our idea is to post it every Friday at noon Central European time. So it means 6 o'clock in the morning in your eastern zone of North America. But you can find it every Friday. We hope to be out there and spread the news. And have a good
Thanks,
swim.
Fredrik. You too.
Okay. Yeah, I love to swim. Take care. See you. Bye.